Get ready to be inspired by the great things happening in rural education. The Rural Scoop will bring you new ideas and innovative solutions. We'll dive into education issues and we'll highlight what's working in your rural communities. You will hear from a variety of educators, administrators, professionals, and others who will provide relevant and engaging content in each episode. And now, serving up the scoop, here's your host, Dr. Melissa Sadorf.
Welcome back to the Rural Scoop. I'm your host, Dr. Melissa Sadorf, and today we're looking at rural schools through a filmmaker's lens and a neighbor's heart. My guest is Beth Benedix, who's a professor emerita at DePauw University and the founder of 𝐂𝐥𝐸, a nonprofit that creates learning experiences where students feel seen, heard, valued, and empowered. She's also the producer of a feature documentary called North Putnam, which follows a year in an Indiana rural school district and the community that it serves, with an eye on sparking action-oriented conversations on how schools and communities can rise together. The film, that's directed by Joel Feldman, with Beth as the producer, aims to reach across divides and reminds us that public education is a community project. So Beth, welcome to the Rural Scoop. I'm so glad that you're here.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I'm really glad to be here.
Well, I want to start with you and your story. You've had a very rich career as an educator, an author, a nonprofit founder, and now a film producer, a lot of stuff. What was the moment when you knew that you wanted to tell this story of a rural district and its community through film?
It was a surprise to me that this became that I went in this direction. I had been working so that the film is a special initiative of my nonprofit organization, which started in 2011. And I had been thinking for quite some time, just thinking about how do we get people to become more familiar with what's happening in our schools, because they're just not. And so how do we help people to see and then understand why our schools need so many resources? So it was really one of those kind of serendipity kinds of things that everything happened the way that it did. But I was putting together a syllabus for a class that I was teaching on existentialism. And I just say the name of it because the film that came across my desk as I was putting the syllabus together was another film by Joel Feldman called Man on Fire, which was amazing. It was about a story of a preacher in a small rural town in Texas who sets himself on fire to protest the racist history of the town. And I saw that trailer, and I knew that I needed to have that film on my syllabus. So I immediately reached out to Joel. And Joel was just so gracious, and he offered to Zoom in with my students after we had a chance to watch. And so we did that. And that film, Man on Fire, just struck me that it was just a very interesting and humble way to tell a story that needs to be told. And then when I had a chance to have that next interaction with Joel, and to see the way that he interacted with my students, I just really liked him. I found him really thoughtful and humble. And it was this kind of one of those flash, maybe completely chutzpah-laden moments that 2 days after he came to the class, I wrote to him and I said, yeah, I have this idea. Would you maybe be interested in doing a film on public schools? And essentially, like the immediate thought was, why do we need these kinds of schools for our democracy? And he said yes. And so that's how it started. But I never intended to do a film, although I'm actually starting the process of doing another film. So I guess I'm doing another film. But it struck me in that moment that the kind of storytelling that film provides is perhaps the kind of storytelling that people really would resonate with. So yeah.
In your bio, you write about your nonprofit, 𝐂𝐥𝐸, being dedicated to providing learning experiences for students where they feel seen, heard, valued, and empowered. And I love that. How did this mission shape the way that you approach the film, from selecting North Putnam as the location to the way that you filmed it?
Yeah. So when Joel and I first decided, this is something that we want to do, we pretty quickly zeroed in on the idea of it being a case study approach, so that we could zero in on a community and a school district and use that as our way of kind of helping people to see, help people to see that what looks like maybe very, particular challenges are actually quite universal in this sphere. And it became clear at that moment that it really had to be North Putnam, because I had been working with 3 school districts, and North Putnam just had this from the very beginning, my very first interactions with North Putnam, when I received a grant to expand our programming into North Putnam, it was clear to me that there was just something very, very different in the way that they operated. And part of what was so different and so beautiful, and what I wanted to showcase, is that they have created a culture where everybody seems to feel and to be seen, heard, valued, and empowered, that they have been very intentional in the kind of community that they've built there. Mm-hmm. So that was the first step, was that zeroing in on North Putnam was a way to make that very clear, that those were our values. And then the next step, I think, was to decide to make the choice that we were going to do an entirely observational, fly-on-the-wall approach. So there was nothing directive. There was no kind of agenda or prescriptive. We just wanted everybody to have the space to be who they were and to be represented as who they are, and not challenge them on, they're just given that space to be who they are. So that really was very important to me, as important as it is as a kind of a pedagogical model, to create a space in the film that people could feel that way.
Beth, you grew up immersed in small town life, and then turned your attention to the broader questions of school and community and culture. Can you talk a little bit about what aspects of growing up rural do you still carry in your work today, including the film with North Putnam?
Actually, I didn't grow up in small town life. I grew up outside of Philadelphia, in sort of the suburbs of Philadelphia, which is, I think, a different kind of experience altogether. There were very many rural aspects of it at the time, much more than are now, where every square inch has been developed. But I didn't myself have that experience. So when I came to Greencastle, when I got the job at DePauw, that's what brought me to Greencastle in Putnam County. That's really when I became aware of, there's something very different and very, very special about this kind of community. And it took a while to find that, because when I first got there, I was, a young faculty member trying to do whatever I could to make sure that I was doing all the things I needed to be doing, at the university. And so I didn't spend as much time out, it's the bubble effect. And it was only when I had the idea about starting the castle, which was about 10 years after I moved to Greencastle, that's when I met my real people, my people, who were mostly community members, many of whom did grow up in the community. And it was at that point when I became immersed in the community, and it became a real lived experience for me. That's when I started to, it opened up my eyes so much to the interesting, just how different it was, really how different it was growing up in the suburbs versus seeing the way kids grow up in a rural community, where there is a comfort, there's a mesh, which we didn't have. The suburbs are, even then they were, pretty anonymous. We had our little pockets of people that knew us, but a huge school that, and there's something so comforting and beautiful about being in a place where everybody knows each other. Sometimes that feels a little claustrophobic, but I think in some ways, that experience, my experience growing up, was not, I didn't find that to be a particularly, it wasn't a great experience, let's just say. And I think I've been, in some ways, carrying what that felt like with me into what I would hope could be different in a school, into school setting.
Right.
Yeah.
So the film took years to produce. It wasn't a fast process, and you were embedded in the district during that time. Can you talk a little bit about what surprised you about rural community dynamics while you were doing that work, either in the district or in partnerships or with the parents and students and the teachers that you interacted with?
Yeah, it was not a quick process, and it was. What was surprising to me was how open everybody was to let us just become part of, like, literally the fabric of their lives for nearly 2 years. That's how long it took to do the shooting. There was the preparation before and then post-production, but the actual period that we were there shooting was almost 2 years. And everybody was so, once we got the go-ahead, it was like, yeah, just come, be here, capture whatever you need to capture. They let us sit in on so many meetings, and capture meetings that you. I think I expected there to be more resistance, and it was so lovely that there wasn't. So that was really surprising to me, and I think also surprising, but not necessarily. North Putnam, we chose North Putnam because North Putnam is so special, but it was surprising to me how interesting and productive their meetings were. Like coming from the academic world where, meetings rarely go anywhere, that you didn't necessarily need to have the meeting to get to where you got at the end. But at North Putnam, they were just so intentional about the way that they kind of moved through things. And they thought that I was crazy because there was once we filmed like a 3-hour administrative meeting. And it was like no time went by. And I told them, I was like, this is the most fascinating thing I've ever seen. And they were looking at me like, what is the matter with you? I said, well, it started with, one of the administrators had just gotten back from a conference where it was 2 administrators who had gone, and they learned about these like interactive practices. So they started this meeting with everybody getting up and doing this sort of like dance moves to Rockin' Robin. And then just from there, it was like, and then they just kept getting things done in very interesting and thoughtful ways. And that surprised me also, to see what it looks like when people can actually, come together to move things forward.
I love that. Fun. Yes. And having worked both K-12 and the higher ed, I understand that perception of meetings. I'll leave it at that. So North Putnam is described as showing the interdependence between public schools and the community's development. And it's a big piece of what you are highlighting in this film. How do you define that interdependence, which is really what it is? And how might a superintendent that works in a rural community like that recognize it in their own context?
Yeah. Yes. So it was important to me that people understood the 360, 360-degree view of what it looks like in these communities, where the schools are the hub of the community. And sometimes, like in the case of North Putnam, it serves the largest land mass in the county. It's very large, and the transportation is a bigger issue in the North Putnam School District than it is in any of the other districts in Putnam County. And so sometimes it's hard to know what's going on in all of these little, these little communities that are being served. What is important, I think, for people to understand is that when you have intentionality built in at the level of the school system about recognizing that there are so many challenges that kids and their families are living with that we don't always see, and they don't always manifest. That there has to be more of a proactive approach. So the school district, I think, needs to think of ways to make sure that it's very clear that they are accessible, that parents are invited, and families feel welcome, and that it's a relationship that is a loving relationship, as opposed to and reciprocal, as opposed to, I think sometimes there is an element of, not particularly, at least as a Midwest kind of virtue, as we're not going to ask for help. We can do it ourselves, kind of thing. Yeah. And that's very real, and that's very important, and it's very important, particularly in the context of that as a virtue, that people feel dignity and a sense that they are being seen and heard, and really, it's not this way in which we're going to go out there and we're going to save you. This is a two-way door here. Yeah. That was very important. And so to try to help people understand what that looked like, we needed to do a lot of work to show various kinds of relationships. So we were really interested to show, what does it look like when a guidance counselor who used to be a teacher goes into the Putnam County jail so that he can be there for a former student who's been going through a really difficult time and has been in and out of jail for drug use. People need to see that, because he's not an anomaly. He's extraordinary, this man that we depict. But I would hasten to say that there must be many, many like him in their communities. Yeah. What does it mean to understand that there are a number of kids that are in school that are struggling maybe on a personal level with issues like they're coming from a farming family, and there might be either an unstated or explicit expectation that that's the path that they're going to choose, and maybe that's not the path that they want to choose. No. Or maybe despite the fact that it might be the path that they want to choose, they're dealing with what it looks like to be a small farm in a rural community and become part of a large conglomeration, right? I mean, these are the sorts of issues that I think people don't really think about when revitalization efforts. There are people, we try to show this pieces of this wonderful group that is working very hard to revitalize the community. And they are doing everything that they can do. And it's hard because the downtown there's only a few towns served by the North Putnam community that even have what you would call, towns. A lot of it is very spread out, rural farmland. But in the towns themselves, there's not much in the way of commerce or resources. And so helping people see that it's not for lack of trying, it's not for lack of will. There are these wonderful people that know that these are the things that are necessary. And part of the way that they're able to work towards getting the resources that they're looking for is deeply connected to the schools. Yeah. So I think that's really, that to me is part of the message, is that people, I'm hoping, take away with us, that we can't look at either the school or the community in a vacuum. Like they're constantly playing together.
Yeah, well said. Beth, there's a piece that you wrote that's called On Painting School Walls, A Love Story. And it documents culture building in this district, whether it was murals or student voice or art, those kinds of collaborations. What does culture building look like in rural schools where those resources that you mentioned are pretty tight, and yet the expectations and the identities are very deeply rooted?
Yeah. Thank you for bringing it. It was so important to me to write that piece, because it just was so obvious to me that the way that they were doing it was the way that you build the kind of culture. And extremely sad to say. In many ways, that film was a time capsule, because there are a number of ways, and there are a number of things that no longer hold true. So there's been a lot of turnover. But one of the things that is about to no longer hold true is that I believe that they are painting over the walls of the high school, which is what was at the center of that article. So what was so beautiful about the culture that had really settled over the place as a matter of years and years of intentional building of that culture was a sense that, like, we all have a stake in this building. This is everybody's building. This is everybody's space. So how does it help? How do we make it everybody's space? Mm. And part of what was so successful about that was the former principal, who I always joke with. I think he is the hero of the film, honestly, because he is the only one who, in capturing him in his daily life as a principal, he's the only one who actually has the occasion to come out and say something that is deeply personal to him about what he believes public education is for. Mm. And he was really a big part of creating that culture of the walls being covered with things that students wanted them covered with. And you see him in the film. He's also the one who invites the sophomore class in, and he asks them, and then listen to he asks them, what are the biggest challenges at the school? And then how do we try to address them? Mm. That, to me, that is how you build a culture that makes people feel seen. You really care about what they're telling. You don't just ask them so that you can say that you've asked them and then discount the thing that they said. You ask them and then you listen to what they're telling you, and then you honor that. It doesn't mean that you necessarily accept every piece of advice or every suggestion, but you create a space where it's obvious that your voice matters. So, yeah.
Many of our rural communities are portrayed in external narratives as lagging or under-resourced. And in the film, you take a very different approach that's more empathetic and nuanced. Can you talk a little bit about how you see rural schools defying those deficit narratives, and how can rural leaders use film or their own stories to shift those narratives?
Yeah. That's really interesting, and it's tricky, I think. It's tricky in Indiana right now because of the new it had already been a mandate, but I think they doubled down on it, which is the third grade measure of if students don't pass the IREAD standardized tests, they're going to be held back. I start by saying that sometimes it's very difficult to push back against the deficit-based approach when you have legislation that is deficit-based, right? So I am very much in favor of giving kids all of the support that they need, and I'm in favor of having standardized tests that help to measure where kids are, because we need to know. But I think when you start to do that kind of legislation that has already normed and standardized where a child should be, you've already moved away from asset-based. Because to me, asset-based, that approach is meeting people where they are and not assuming that they should be anywhere different. Which is not to say that there aren't. It's also a way of thinking about how you build very high expectations and very high aspirations into a system. Deficit-based does the opposite, I think. It starts by assuming the lowest possible expectations, and it assumes that everything's good enough, right? As long as we get to this good enough place, it's good enough. And that is very detrimental, I think. It's detrimental on every level. But when you're talking about a school culture, it's extremely detrimental to kids who come in and have that become the message from the very beginning, is that we don't quite think you're capable of this thing. So let's, and this is always so well intentioned. And so I'm not trying to sound like I know better. I'm not a person who has a background in developmental psychology or in education studies. But I have seen in my own classrooms, and I've seen being around a lot of K-12 kids because of the castle, that the kids rise to the level that you've set. And if they can't quite meet that, then you readjust and you have a conversation and you think, okay, you reevaluate. But I've seen again and again and again what happens to kids when they feel like they're being told that they're not capable of doing X, Y, and Z. And in a rural context, I mean, it's bad in any context, but I think it's particularly detrimental in a rural context where there often are not the same access to resources that you have in a suburban or urban kind of situation, where, a kid can then say, that's what they're telling me over here in this sphere, but I'm going to go, I'm going to be the fantastic musician and go to the club where I'm playing, or whatever the thing is, and know that there's a way that they are affirmed and seen for who they are and who they see themselves to be. In a rural community, there often aren't those other outlets where kids can feel validated. So to me, that's why it's so important that we recognize that it's not just that an asset-based approach is the richest approach, because it means that we are looking at the world around us in terms of how do we recognize all of these rich resources that we have around us. But psychologically, I think it contributes to these cultures of abundance, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely, it does. And I agree. So let's assume, practical impact for a rural school and its teachers. Let's assume that there's been a screening of the film, which you had many across the country, where you had a rural district faculty that was in a meeting together and watching this film together. What are the discussions or the action steps that you would want them to immediately wrestle with? Not just what do we like, but more importantly, what will we do as a result of having watched this?
There's a thread in the film that is one of my favorites that I had to actually fight for, because we're having a difference of opinion of what makes for interesting film. And, Joe gets the trump card on that one because he's because he's an amazing filmmaker and he's made so many films. But in my gut, I knew that we had to show this thread where there was a team-taught gen ed classroom. The decision was made that rather than hold these kids back, which would have been the traditional approach, they decided to make a classroom that was taught by two teachers, a gen ed classroom. Yep. And so we get to see a lot in that storyline. We get to see classroom, what it looks like in the classroom. We get to see what it looks like with two teachers, with one parent, and how nice that is to get two different approaches. But one of the coolest things about that is that we get to see from the top down how the administrators were fully behind this initiative and how excited they were. And so we get to see this unpacking session with the two teachers involved, the principal and the superintendent. And we get to see the gains that were made for those kids that were huge. And I think maybe of all of the clear, concrete kind of action items that come out of the film, that would be, let's look at this thing. That to me is one of the most exciting, is because it's something that you could do that is worth talking about. a very concrete way of thinking about what the classroom could look like if you took this approach. So that's a big one for me. The other things that I think I would like to have conversations around in a setting where we're talking with administrators and teachers, is to talk about those moments, the different leadership styles, and how all of them were embraced within one district, but how different they are. So you have the high school principal, who's very, very quiet. His style is to kind of pull back so that he can provide space for the kids. And there's several scenes. There's the one where he's asking the kids. There's another scene towards the end where the kids who have in creating a film in this way, fly on the wall style, we didn't give many context cues. So I think sometimes it might be difficult for an audience to know exactly what's happening. But in this case, it was the kids who had IEPs who were about to start in the high school. And so Jason, the high school principal, made the decision, okay, how am I going to welcome these kids into school for the first time? Let's play a game. And let's all sit down at the table together in a circle and play a game that gets them to try to solve a problem. And I think that, I mean, and the number of, every principal gets to choose how they're going to create culture and how they're going to welcome kids in. I thought that was spectacular. And then you have the principal at the middle school who has a very different leadership style. He is very high energy, very like a big kid himself. And he is very successful because he is authentically him. And I think that would be an interesting conversation, is what for districts maybe to look at themselves and think about, are we providing the space for our teachers and our administrators to be authentically who they are? And supporting them. Because we want our kids to be authentically who they are. So how do we, I think that I think that is a really important conversation. Yeah, I don't know. Does that answer?
Yeah, absolutely. So the castle's mission includes spillover with joy, creativity, relevance, rigor, and authenticity. How do you keep those high aspirations alive in a rural classroom, Beth, under the pressure of things like budget issues and state mandates and staffing concerns and all of those things that we know that rural leaders have on their plate?
Yeah. In my view, the coolest thing about having those virtues as your aimed for, this is the kind of environment we want to create, is it doesn't take money, really. I mean, you need some money to be able to do it, but those are not high ticket items. They're not high ticket items. Those are thinking about how you enter a room and who you fill the room with and the energy that you fill the room with. And that's, to me, that's like the most important sort of piece in trying to think about how do we make our schools places where the learning sticks. Primarily, that's what's important to me, because that's what I think is most important for our kids. If they connect with it, they understand why they're doing what they're doing. It's part of a larger narrative of helping them to determine paths for themselves that they're really excited about. That doesn't take that's takes a lot of messy human work, which is great, which is wonderful. But I think that's part of the message that I would love for people to come away with, is that you don't need money to make these things happen. Money is wonderful and resources are tremendous. And when you see the gross disparity between places that are very high resource schools and very low resource schools, I'm not trying to be Pollyanna about it. Those resources matter and they make possible a lot. But all things being equal, if we can create spaces where everybody feels excited about what's happening in that classroom. And this means that the teachers are excited because the experiences that are happening are doing what they need to be doing anyway. They're just doing them in a way, it's helping them meet the standards that they need to be meeting. But it's helping them meet the standards in ways that the kids are then going to take that material, they're going to make it theirs, they're going to see connections between what they're doing in that class and in other classes. Something's going to spark, and it might be the thing that lights them up, that puts them on the path. If we can create those kind of classrooms, then we have a kind of autonomy that doesn't make the funding issues remain, but that's, I think, how we safeguard against it. And I think right now we are in a terrifying, an absolutely terrifying landscape. And so it's hard to not be in that space of terror and feeling this true scarcity. It's truly scarce. Mm. But if there's a way to help people overcome that terror, to be able to say, my classroom, my classroom, I'm so excited about what I can do in this classroom with these kids. That to me is that's what I'm hoping, that people can start to feel, that kind of excitement. And that's the kind of work that we do in the castle. It's all about thinking about how do the people in our, I feel like Mr. Rogers, who are the people in our neighborhood, right? I mean, it's that kind of a model. Like, how do we find the perfect match between what the teachers, that's how all the conversations start with what the kind of programming we do in the schools is. We ask the teachers that we're working with, what is it that you really want to be enhancing? What curricular standards do you really want to be enhancing? And if you had your magic wand and you could wave it, what would that look like? What kind of experience would you like us to try to bring into the classroom to enhance? And then we find the people that we can do that with. And it's really exciting. For what's so lovely about that model is that it's very simple. It sounds complicated. The complicated piece is doing the complicated matchmaking, which I actually love to do because it's so human. But it's a very simple idea. It's like, and then the kids just get to see how the thing that they're working on in the classroom lives in the world in many different ways. So
can you expand on that a little bit more, Beth? Because I know that there are listeners that are probably looking for partnerships in their rural communities, and you partnered with a district and a filmmaker and executive producers to create this film. But for rural schools that are seeking to partner, whether it's with local businesses or higher ed or art organizations, whatever they have around them, what would you point them to as either a model or some first steps to consider to ensure that they have an effective plan for mutual benefit with these partners that they want to collaborate with?
Yeah. I think you start with an asset mapping exercise, quite literally. You have that conversation and you think about who are the people in our neighborhood, right? Like, and where's the intersection between these people and in every classroom, the curriculum that we're teaching, where are those unique points of intersection? And that's what we do at the castle. We have tremendous partnerships with DePaul University, which I think is a place many rural communities are in the situation that Putnam County is in, which is that and you get that kind of town gown dynamic, where you have a college or a university with tremendous resources, and you have a community with far fewer. And if you're living in a community that has access to a college or a university, that's one of the first places of contact, I think, is to think about. One of the most exciting things to me about the castle is that as a college professor, the kids at DePaul they're my kids. They're the ones that I'm, most connected to. And I watched how transformative it was for DePauw students to be doing this kind of experience, which is not just outreach. It's literally finding the intersection. So finding ways that the work that the DePauw students are doing in their discipline intersect. And then students at DePauw the ones that participate learn their material in a much more embodied way. The faculty learn their material in a much more embodied way that helps them to think about how they're going to teach it. So it's approaching, and it's not just DePauw that we work with. We work with a number of community artists, with all kinds of industries. So for instance, like this was like a beloved workshop that we did for a couple of years where we worked with a detective. There was an 8th grade science classroom that was starting to do a genetics unit. And so he came and he did a forensics super cool workshop where he set it up as a kind of a crime scene, and the kids were dusting for fingerprints, and they learned that material because our local detective came in. And I think any community is going to, when you shift the lens to asset-based, to start thinking about where's the intersection. It's so much fun. It's just so much fun because you start to think about, oh my gosh, it didn't even occur to me that maybe, as a detective, I have something to bring into an 8th grade science class. And so it's like this constant good feedback loop because everybody who's involved is reaffirmed that they have something valuable to offer. So that's my suggestion is you start with an asset mapping activity, and then rather than trying to create whole scale a program or an organization or anything like that, teacher, this happens all the time. Community-based learning is so much more prevalent than it ever used to be. So if teachers could dedicate just one unit in their classroom to finding a really interesting community partner that is either going to bring a real world problem into the classroom in true project-based learning style, or is going to bring some kind of craft that they have. We had a local potter. He just came and he just literally set up his wheel in the middle of the classroom. And the kids just stood around him and just mesmerized. And in the course of just having the kids with this very successful artist being humanized in this way, the kinds of questions that they started to ask were just fascinating to me. They were young. This was at a primary school level, elementary school rather. And the kids were asking questions like, how much did that wheel cost? How'd you get the money for that? And so all of a sudden, what became this lesson in pottery just took a detour into thinking about finances and grant writing. And I mean, like, you just never know where. So that's another kind of suggestion that I have, is that when you find these partnerships, don't script them too heavily. Like, have in the model that we have these very important non-negotiables, and they are that we don't want people coming into the classroom that are professing onto the kids. Yeah, it's a place where we're trying to create a space of hands-on, experiential, everybody's in it together, creative problem solving, but beyond that, it's all good. It's all good. So I would say, as long as the teachers have had an intentional conversation with the people they're bringing into their classroom about what they need, their objectives, because that also is a non-negotiable. You can't waste teachers' time, period. So then I think then the teachers are going to feel, I think, liberated to do something like this, because they know that they're not wasting their time. And in fact, the time that they're spending is going to be that much more potentially effective. The kids are going to learn material in that much more of an embodied way.
Beth, given what you saw in North Putnam, what gives you hope about the future of rural education right now?
I think what gives me hope is that rural communities are already set up to have these kinds of deep, meaningful relationships in ways that I think suburban and urban schools might not. I mean, I think that is the true beauty and magic of rural communities, is that it's already there. You're not forcing it. It's everybody knows everybody. So it doesn't take a big next step to bring somebody that everybody already knows in another context into the classroom. It's already set up for that. And that gives me hope, because I think that everything's about relationships, particularly in the classroom. I mean, that's where learning starts, is when kids feel safe and loved and able to express themselves. And rural communities, because, often I don't want to be Pollyanna or anything like that about it. And I'm sure, and there are many challenges as well, but I think just structurally, we're set up to prioritize the relationship as the thing that needs to be the grounding for the rest to happen. It's built into our ethos here.
Well, you may have already answered my last question that I usually ask my guests, and that is, what does the term rural advantage mean to you, either to you personally or to rural education writ large?
Yeah, I think the rural advantage really does have to do with that emphasis on relationships. And we are living in strange times. We're living in scary times, and we need each other. We just do. And I think rural communities get that. And there's also the capacity. There's a lot of polarization here for sure. There's a lot of polarization, but there's the capacity for the polarization to be in interesting ways compartmentalized, so that, you can say, you know what, we're not having that conversation, but the conversation that we want to have about how we make things as beautiful as possible for our kids, we're going to have that conversation, because, and then they do. And that, to me, is a rural advantage, is that, and that might be surprising to people who don't live in these communities, for whom these communities might seem like, flyover country. These are not your audiences. These are the people who don't think about rural communities, who view them as flyover. I think that might come as a surprise, that you can have very divided opinion, and also at the end of the day, you can have people just really care about each other. And that's an advantage.
Yeah. Well said. Well, Beth, I want to thank you for this conversation, and really for the care that you've taken to let a rural community tell its story with dignity. And I think that North Putnam reminds us that what happens in a classroom is really never separate from what happens on Main Street, and that those strong schools that we all want our rural communities to have is really a part of being a strong community. Those things are not mutually exclusive.
Thank you. Yes, I completely agree. Thank you.
Well, friends, here's the invitation. Please take this episode into your next leadership team meeting, or your teacher team, or your Friday night game, and ask, what would it look like for our town to show up for its kids in new ways this year? And then pick one thing, just one thing, and do it. If this episode resonated, please make sure that you like and follow and subscribe the Rural Scoop, and share it with a colleague or a board member or a community member who believes, like we do, that rural schools are the heartbeat of their towns. Remember, the rural advantage isn't geography, it's belonging. It's everyday decisions to see each student clearly and to lead together so that our communities don't just get by, they thrive. I'm Melissa Sadorf, and thanks for joining me on the Rural Scoop. I'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Rural Scoop. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep these important rural conversations going. And we'd love to hear from you, so feel free to leave a comment or share your thoughts. You can follow along and never miss a new release by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform or by following us on social. We're on YouTube at The Rural Scoop, Instagram at msadorf1, and X at msadorf03. The Rural Scoop is produced with support from Vela Educational Consultants. To learn more, visit velaconsultants.com. See you next time for more great discussions about rural education. And as always, keep leaning in to the rural advantage.